All right, so we are live. Hello, welcome back everyone to Brainstorm Live. My name is Emily, and today I am so pleased to introduce you all to Dr. Tabibnia. She is a affective neuroscience researcher at the University of California, Irvine, and today she is going to tell us about the neuroscience of resilience. So for those who are new or unfamiliar with our format, we're going to take the first hour for the presentation. And if you have any questions that are more discussional, please keep those for the end. We will have an informal Q&A for the last 30 minutes. However, if at any point during the presentation you want clarification about what's on the slides, please go ahead and ask during the presentation. Also keep a lookout. I will be sending in the link for the CE certificates about 3/4 of the way through. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Tabibnia.
Great. All right. Thank you so much. Let me share my screen. Okay. So yeah, thank you for introducing me and thank you for inviting me to come and speak here. I'm super excited to speak with you for a couple of reasons. So as you know, my work centers around the translation of basic neuroscience to clinical practice. And it's not every day that I get to talk to a group of like-minded people who are on the clinical end of things. So this is really exciting for me to kind of hear about to what extent the work that I and my colleagues do really relates to the real world, where it really matters. And then another reason I'm excited to be here is kind of a personal note about my background that I just want to quickly share is that I have actually been out of academic research for many years. I'm basically just coming off of an 8-year hiatus from academia. I had to take some time off to take care of a very sick family member. And this person is now doing great. And so I'm returning to academia. I'm picking up where I left off. And I'm thrilled to be here now and to engage in discussion with you all about a topic that I've become more and more interested in, which is emotional resilience. So when I talk about building emotional resilience, just kind of a definitional thing here, I'm really speaking very broadly about improving psychological wellness overall. So not just in terms of improvements in mental health symptomology in the face of adversity, but just psychological wellness broadly. And I think that'll become clear as I go more into the slides. All right, let me see if I can get my mouse to work. Okay, so my roadmap for today's presentation is very simple. It has 3 parts. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of a neuroscience primer, which might be just basic review for a lot of you, but just so we're all on the same page, I'll talk about the effect of stress and coping on the brain. And then I'll talk about the paper that might have been circulated that maybe you've looked at, introducing a framework of, or a neuroscience-based framework of resilience that I've been working on. And then we'll talk about the applications of the framework and some of the recent research I've been doing to kind of that fits within that framework. I see there's a chat in the box. I'm not sure if that's for me. Oh, I guess we could. All right. Also, I'm not good at multitasking at all, as it become obvious. So pardon me if you put stuff in the chat box and I miss it. All right, so I don't know if this group is familiar. Does anyone remember seeing these ads, these anti-drug commercials? I mean, they're very old. They're like from the 80s or 90s. Yeah, I see some nods. So for those of you who haven't seen this, it's basically representing what drugs do to the brain. So the egg is your brain and the hot sizzling frying pan is drugs. And then the egg on the frying pan is supposed to be your brain on drugs. All right, so when people ask me to know what's the effect of stress on the brain, I kind of think of this poster and so just replace the word drugs with stress, and it's kind of like the same concept. I mean, obviously that's a hyperbole. It's a little bit hyperbolic, but there's very good evidence that too much stress is bad for the brain. And I want to get a little specific about what we mean by that. So stress compromises the prefrontal cortex. And so let me break that down. So here we're looking at a side view of the brain with the prefrontal cortex here represented in blue being right behind the forehead. And so the prefrontal cortex is our executive brain. It's specialized for higher cognitive functions like decision-making, self-control, regulation of emotions. And contrast that with the structures in red that are evolutionarily older, more preserved, some people like to say more primitive parts of the brain, including the amygdala, that are important for emotions and triggering the fight or flight response, and the basal ganglia that are important for habits. And now, in the absence of stress, when a person feels safe and alert, the prefrontal cortex can function normally. So the prefrontal cortex can regulate our impulses, regulate our emotions, our habits, our thoughts, but the arrows can point the other way too. The primitive brain can regulate the prefrontal cortex as well, particularly when we are stressed. So for example, when you're driving and you suddenly realize that another car is about to hit you, that emotional arousal kind of quiets down the prefrontal cortex so that your reflexive brain can take over. So your emotions and your habits can kick in. And this is often a good thing because in a lot of emergencies, there's no time to think. You want your reflexive brain to take over because it can act fast. But the problem is that when a stressor is chronic or prolonged, like being in an abusive relationship, for instance, it exaggerates this mechanism and it can become a problem. Because then, as you can see, the very brain regions that we need to regulate our emotions are now compromised. And this can lead to a vicious cycle where stress begets more stress. Now, this is only half of the story. Oh, wait, actually, I guess I'm supposed to talk about the take-home message first. So I guess this is why it's important to nip stress in the bud before it becomes overwhelming. So addressing or mitigating stress today or proactively is better than waiting around to do it later. But this is only half the story of stress in the brain. And the better half of the story is that there is a way out of this rut and it's coping, right? So doing things that can reduce harm from stress. So we'll spend a lot of time talking about various coping strategies, but at a neural level, just as stress compromises prefrontal circuitry, coping does the opposite. Coping strengthens prefrontal coping circuitry. And that's because of this phenomenon in neuroscience where neurons that fire together wire together, meaning that brain cells that are active at the same time end up strengthening their connection to each other. So this is a bit of an oversimplification, but if your stress neurons are active at the same time as your coping neurons, the connection between them gets stronger so that the next time you encounter stress, coping kicks in more easily. So for instance, rats that are given the opportunity to control a stressful situation show lasting changes in their prefrontal cortex and in their amygdala. And they cope better with future stress, even if that future stress is different than what they've encountered before. So the learning generalizes, it transfers to novel contexts. So there's truth to the saying that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And this effect is a well-demonstrated phenomenon called stress inoculation. As the name suggests, it just means that a little bit of stress inoculates or immunizes you, kind of like a vaccine, to future exposures to stress. So just as stress begets stress, coping begets coping. Did anyone have a clarifying question or anything like that? I heard some.
Yeah, in the chat, someone's just wondering how you would define coping.
Oh, yeah. So I'm using a very rudimentary definition of coping, which basically is referring to reducing harm from stress. So doing things that reduce harm from stress. And so we'll go over some examples of coping. And I'm open. We can just, I would like to hear from you guys as well, like how you guys typically define coping. But maybe just to keep going here. So the take-home message here is that confronting your stress today can not only help you manage the stress at hand, but it can also make it easier to manage future stress. And this is part of the reason operational training, for example, for police officers and military is so important, because there's value in exposing trainees to some manageable stress during training, so that they can have the opportunity to strengthen their coping skills. And it's not just in the rat brain that coping causes lasting beneficial change. There are dozens of coping strategies, some of which I've listed here, the broad categories, that boost, so there's dozens of these types of strategies that boost resilience and change the nervous system in humans. And I'm not going to go over those specific strategies quite yet. Here, I just want to point out the importance of neuroplasticity, the concept of the brain changing in response to experience, which is the basis of learning. And so coping can change the brain in ways that are consistent with resilience. So it can lower amygdala activity, for instance, even in adulthood. So I think that when people realize this, or they are reminded that they can rewire their brains, it can boost their confidence in being able to change. So I think, and hopefully I'm in good company here, that neuroscience should be taught in resilience training programs everywhere, and or in clients who might benefit from sort of this knowledge, this level of knowledge of how the brain manages emotions. So, part of this is because I think having this sort of optimistic or positive mindset can have an important impact on resilience learning. As you may know, what we know from research, that when you have positive expectations, they can become fulfilling prophecies. Same with having a growth mindset, right? So having a growth versus a fixed mindset, meaning you have the belief that your mind can learn and change and grow, actually improves learning, right? So having this sort of mindset is important in the context of learning resilience, because it's important to understand that resilience is not a personality trait. It can be trained. And another mindset tool to facilitate resilience learning is self-affirmation, right? Reminding yourself of past accomplishments. That can help because it provides evidence that you can do it, that you can surmount challenge. So the take-home message here is that there's plenty of empirical reason to have realistic optimism and a positive mindset about resilience learning. So, when I talk about reasons to be optimistic, I'm kind of playing around with different types of reasons. So on the one hand, we are justified in having optimism because adult brains are malleable. On the other hand, at the same time, we want to be optimistic and have a positive mindset because the optimism itself, that positive mindset, can facilitate resilience learning. And as we'll see later, that kind of positivity can activate brain circuits that are important for resilience. And another point to make here on this slide is about that big, thick arrow going into the brain. So what I'm trying to depict there is that any single resilience strategy probably has a small effect on resilience, but I think that these strategies work in an additive way so that the more of these strategies you can implement, the bigger the impact. So people have argued, just like risk factors can add up to increase a person's vulnerability to mental illness, so do resilience factors can add up to protect a person from mental illness. All right, so far we've talked about the effect of stress and coping on the brain, and now I want to move into talking about the neuroscience framework for building resilience. So until a couple of years ago, as far as I could tell, there was no comprehensive or unifying theory out there of resilience, particularly a neuroscience-based theory that accounted for the 30 or so evidence-based strategies that we know of that help build resilience. And what I was really interested in was, so what are the common denominators here? Are all these different strategies helping us in 30 different ways, or are there some common underlying pathways that they're all tapping into? So you might ask, I guess I sort of answered that second question, that second bullet point already. So why do we need a theory? One is to identify common denominators like that, but also just it's good to have a good theory. For the general reason of wanting a good, so why do we need a unifying theory? Is so for the same reason that we want a good theory, right? So any good theory We want it because it can help us make predictions. It can help us discover knowledge, discover novel interventions, right? So a good theory helps you be generative. And so why a neurally based theory? Well, I believe that studying the brain is just another way of studying the mind, right? So I'd like to argue that by identifying the specific pathways that lead to enhanced resilience, we can then work backwards and identify strategies that we know recruit that pathway, but that haven't fully been investigated yet as a potential intervention. And this way we can gain insight into novel interventions. All right, so I guess we should always start with definitions. So my definition of resilience is also quite broad. It basically refers to adaptive functioning despite acute or chronic adversity. And it includes mental health and physical health measures, as I'll go over in a moment. But also I want to highlight that I think of resilience as a collection of resources that can be built upon rather than being a stable trait. Okay, so in developing this neural framework of building resilience, I had one major aim, and it was to identify common pathways underlying behavioral and psychosocial strategies for boosting wellness and resilience. Okay, so the focus was on non-invasive strategies, non-pharmaceutical strategies, just behavioral, cognitive, psychosocial strategies. And so in the reviewed studies, in all those resilience studies that I review in this paper, the operational definition of wellness and resilience that I worked with includes all of the following outcomes: mental health, including related indices like self-reported affect, self-reported quality of life; physical health, including related indices like immune assays, pain management, and longevity and mortality. So any resilience building strategy that had an outcome on any of these outcomes were included in the review. So before I discuss the neuroimaging studies of these various resilience building strategies, I want to share that, sort of build the framework here, which is based on our knowledge of functional neuroanatomy, we can, or I would like to propose a tripartite, or like a three-pathway model of building resilience. And these three pathways, starting at the center, include the fear and stress networks, specifically the amygdala and its targets, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA, and the autonomic nervous system, which includes the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branches. So we know from decades of research that hyperactivity in these networks is associated with poor health outcomes, including poor mental health outcomes like depression and some anxiety disorders. On the flip side, some medications that alleviate these psychiatric symptoms tend to normalize amygdala and HPA function. So these are the types of evidence that suggest this pathway is really important for resilience. Another network that has gained attention as playing an important role in resilience is mesostriatal or dopaminergic reward pathways. So these are the areas of the brain that respond when you find appetizing food like chocolate, or you win money, or you see a picture of a loved one. And decreased activity here has been associated with mental illness like depression, anhedonia, PTSD. And this network can directly buffer the effects of stress. So if you stimulate neurons in this network, it can downregulate amygdala and HPA activity, and it can have an antidepressant effect. And then the third network that has more recently come into the spotlight is the default mode network, which is a network of brain regions. It's very interesting that they are co-active together, and they come on board. So they're active when we're not doing anything, when we're just lying there, we don't have a particular task or cognitive thing that we're doing. So what do we do when we're just sitting there with no task to do? What does our mind do? Where does our mind go? Right? We think about ourselves, right? We think about the people who are important to us. We think about our to-do list, about our past, about our future, right? So as it happens, when people are instructed to think about themselves and these kinds of things, you also see activity in the default mode network. So that's why it's called the default, because that's what your brain defaults to when it doesn't have something else to do. It defaults to this mode of thinking, just self-related thinking. Now, as you can imagine, too much of this kind of thinking, this kind of mind wandering and rumination can be a bad thing. It's associated with bad mood, and a lot of it is associated with mental illness, including depression and addiction. I should say that the default mode network has other functions as well, but kind of self-referential thinking is the main thing. So too much activity here is bad. And then on the flip side, interventions that treat depression and these psychopathologies tend to normalize DMN function. Okay, so and then I should also mention, so I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this because a lot of my work is on the prefrontal cortex. So of course, top-down control over each of these three pathways can be exerted via prefrontal regions that we kind of discussed that support self-regulation and other executive processes. But to kind of sum up this slide, the basic point here is that pharmaceutical and other physiological interventions that alleviate mental health symptoms tend to normalize these brain networks. And as it happens, the same seems to be true of psychosocial interventions, of cognitive and behavioral interventions. So each of the roughly 30 strategies that I alluded to earlier activates at least one of these three pathways. Now, of course, there are other brain regions that are important for resilience as well, but I hope to demonstrate here that this simple model limited to just three pathways can account for a wide range of resilience building strategies. So let's start talking about those strategies, and we'll start with that middle pathway, the amygdala distress networks. And I want to start here by reiterating the point that when we're faced with a stressor, generally the best thing to do is to confront the stressor directly. And I'm open to kind of hearing from your perspective. I guess you guys are the experts. But from my understanding, if at all possible, the best thing to do is to change the source of the stress. But the problem, obviously, is that often we're not really able to change the situation much. But fortunately, there are a host of additional strategies that can be helpful, and there's not enough time to go over all of them. But I guess I already covered stress inoculation, and I'll cover exposure therapy, and affect labeling later. Now I'll just highlight the last two here, starting with cognitive reappraisal. So reappraisal just means reframing or reinterpreting an event in a way that alters its emotional impact. So for example, you could reinterpret a rough experience as an opportunity for growth, as an opportunity to strengthen those coping neuron connections. So that would be an example of cognitive reappraisal, which is related to cognitive restructuring, I think. And so the reason I wanted to point this out is because it's considered one of the most effective emotion regulation strategies in the papers that I've seen. The last one is self-efficacy, which is related to reappraisal. It's basically self-appraisal, right? It's believing that you are capable of coping. This one's also important. It's related to optimism and having a positive mindset. And as it happens, boosting people's self-efficacy helps them cope better, and it alters their connections in their prefrontal cortex. So all the strategies that are listed here in some way help down-regulate the negative. And I should say, so like all these strategies, down-regulate, there's evidence that they down-regulate the amygdala stress network and they boost resilience. All of these strategies here help us down-regulate the negative. So I call it down-regulating the negative. And then now I want to talk about the next pathway, which is the dopaminergic reward networks. And resilience strategies here activate this network and have a general effect of making a person feel good. So we can call this pathway upregulating the positive. And again, all of these strategies boost resilience and activate reward. Just a few to go over. Optimism, I mentioned, is a very important one. And in terms of its neural underpinning in the brain, it's really interesting. So if we define optimism as expectation of positive outcome, well, that's the very thing that our mesostriatal dopamine neurons respond to. So a lot of people think of dopamine neurons as our reward networks. Like, if we drink a really tasty shake or something, our dopamine neurons fire. But what really is happening, actually, it's a little more nuanced than that. These dopamine neurons are particularly sensitive to unexpected reward, so like a surprising reward. And we can discuss why that is if you're interested during the discussion. I'm going to resist the temptation to diverge here. Okay, and the other thing that they respond to is anticipation of reward. So this, my husband and I often joke about how this really explains why it is that when we have a vacation plan coming up, the anticipation of that vacation is often a lot more exciting than when you're on the vacation itself. So like you enjoy the anticipation more than the vacation itself. That's because in part, perhaps these dopamine neurons are going wild during the anticipation phase and not so much during the actual receiving of the reward. And so whenever dopamine neurons do fire, it does give you a feeling of a high, of positive feelings. Anyway, so that's kind of at a cellular level. We can think of optimism being involved in this pathway, but also there's studies showing that having an optimistic bias activates this network. So are you guys familiar with the superiority illusion? Like how everybody believes that they're better than average, which mathematically doesn't really add up. So a lot of us are must be illusioned. But this sort of optimistic illusion or optimistic bias is associated with increased activity in the reward network. And on the flip side, if you administer a dopamine precursor, L-DOPA, to people, it increases their optimistic bias. Anyway, so I don't want to go through this sort of evidence for every single strategy. Obviously, we don't have time, but that one I thought is interesting. Self-affirmation I mentioned earlier as well. So that's thinking about one's past accomplishments or one's important values. And there's evidence that engaging in this type of cognitive thinking can reduce sympathetic arousal. So your stress, fight or flight response, and it can activate reward regions like the ventral striatum. Positive memories is another one that boosts resilience and activates reward. Sleep and physical exercise, you can't overemphasize their importance because not only do they improve physical health, but they also improve mental health and prefrontal cognitive function. That's important for mental health. That's important for regulating emotions. So sleep and exercise, super important. Social connectedness is way up there as well. So decades of research have shown the benefits of social support. And that includes not just having social support, but also giving it. So having support and giving support both are linked to resilience and both are linked to the reward network. They both feel good. So those are the ones I want to highlight. And so far we have a pathway that helps you feel less bad, the amygdala pathway, and then another pathway that helps you feel good, the reward pathway. And then there's an emerging third pathway that's about rising above all that, right? So I like to call it transcending the self. So this pathway involves the default network. And as you might recall, this network is engaged when we think about ourselves, when our minds wander, when we ruminate, which is that excessive negative thinking. And so disengaging from this sort of self-focused, excessive mind wandering, or disengaging from rumination about the past or worry about the future can be very helpful. And there's a few strategies identified for kind of getting you there. I'll mention mindfulness, which is a process of paying attention to the present moment and therefore getting less consumed by self-focused problems of the past and future. And mindfulness has its effect through many pathways, through different pathways, hence the dotted arrows pointing to those other two pathways as well. And exposure to nature is another one. Just going on a 15-minute walk out in the greenery can have a positive impact on mood and decrease activity in the default mode. Having purpose in life has been known for a long time to have an impact on resilience. And some people get that through religious engagement. So having a sense of meaning or purpose, like striving for a valued goal is important. Now, one thing to note here is that I'm not saying that you need to completely eliminate default mode activity or stress response, or that you need to amp up as much as you can the reward network, because obviously that wouldn't make sense, because addictive drugs really stimulate the reward network, but that's not adaptive. So the key thing here is everything in moderation, right? We know from previous studies that in psychopathology, the arrows tend to go in the direction of too much default, too much amygdala, too little reward. And that's why these set of strategies seem to be particularly effective, because they push the arrows in the more adaptive direction. Okay, so I've talked about the framework, and now I'd like to talk about applications of the framework. But first, I guess it's good to kind of take stock of what we talked about so far, kind of unload the working memory load here, just put it on paper and then put it aside. So lessons from the brain, there were 3 major ones. Confronting stress now is easier than confronting it later, because of how stress can overwhelm the prefrontal cortex. Confronting stress now has another benefit, which is not only it helps you now, but it also can help later. And that's because of the learning that occurs and the connections that get strengthened in the brain every time you cope. It makes it easier to cope in the future. And that we talked about the reasons that optimism are warranted about being able to learn resilience. And I talked about a few strategies and their neural networks, but just wanted to point out here that notice that a lot of the strategies in the previous slide are proactive. So we talked about the importance of kind of building resilience proactively or mitigating stress proactively. So things like sleep and exercise and connecting socially and I guess exercising gratitude, which is another one of my favorites, mindfulness, all of these things, we can do them, we can start doing them at any time, and they can help build our arsenal, our resources of resilience to help protect us when we really need it. Okay, so I wanted to kind of talk about applying the tripartite model or applying this framework. And in the process, I'll talk about some of the work I'm doing right now. But I want to talk about 2 angles of kind of using this framework for intervention. One is I think you can use this framework for discovering novel interventions in different ways. One is to test new strategies that we know regulate one of these pathways, but that haven't really been explored fully as an intervention. Another way is to leverage self-transcendence, basically meaning that you can add self-transcendence to existing strategies and make those strategies better. You can kind of along those same lines, you can actually combine a lot of different strategies together to come up with more powerful interventions. And then finally, this thing that I'm recently thinking about, at least in this frame, is what I'm referring to as repurposing, which basically means based on our understanding of the neural mechanisms underlying various psychopathologies, we can repurpose an intervention that was designed for a particular disorder to suit another disorder that has similar underlying neuropathology. So I'll hopefully be able to give a couple of examples of that. And then finally, I think this framework can also be used for tailoring intervention. And there's lots of different ways to think about that, but I'll just give a couple of examples in the context of mindfulness and physical exercise. Okay. So I want to talk about kind of using this framework as a way to discover novel interventions in the context of default mode. So the basic idea here is that if the tripartite model is correct, then any tool that reduces excessive default mode activity should boost wellness. Okay, and so I would like to, and others as well, have suggested that maybe the experience of awe is one of these things that is kind of underexplored, but that has potential. All right, so the awe is the feeling of wonder we experience when we're faced with something greater than ourselves, something that's like beyond our current understanding. So like witnessing a breathtaking panoramic view of nature, or witnessing childbirth, or witnessing a magnificent work of art. It's going to be different things for different people, but my personal favorite is contemplating the vastness of the cosmos. Like, this photo always gets me. It's so the caption of this photo is, if Saturn were as close as the moon, right? So it stops me in my tracks to think like, oh my gosh, it's like just within our own solar system, there's just gigantic planet. And then you think about how far vaster and vaster the universe goes, really gives you perspective into the minutiae of things that kind of weigh you down. And in fact, kind of triggering awe or giving people an awe experience can lead to a feeling of what's called the small self, which is a relatively diminished sense of self, of where we feel that our existence or, well, our goals seem less significant in the context of something that seems vaster than the individual, right? So we end up seeing the self as part of a more important, larger whole. And in fact, awe can trigger people to become more pro-social, to act more pro-socially. So I'm referring here to the work of my colleague Paul Piff here at UC Irvine. Really cool stuff. So anyway, the reason I put awe on the map here is because there are studies showing that when people look at photos or video clips of awe-inducing scenes or like sublime scenes, activity in the default mode network does go down. So then if the tripartite model is correct, then awe might be a thing that could be used as an intervention to boost resilience. And in fact, there are a number of groups who are pursuing this question right now. Dr. Keltner at UC Berkeley, Paul Piff, I already mentioned, Jen Steller. And I'm collaborating right now with Dr. Jeff Thompson at Columbia University, who is also, interestingly, a detective. He's a police officer and a detective at NYPD. And so he's developing this intervention program for police resilience training. And he's got this awe intervention that's pretty cool. So we're interested in seeing whether using this kind of awe intervention can impact psychological wellness in the long term. So awe is just one example of the way of kind of how we can gain insight into a novel intervention. There are other examples too. In my paper, I talk about neutral hypnosis, like just being in a state of hypnotic hypnosis, not even with any hypnotic suggestions, just being in a hypnotic state. But we can talk about these other things later if people are interested. Another way the tripartite framework could be useful is by thinking about how self-transcendence, since now we know it's so important, and self-transcendence in the default mode is kind of understudied. We can think about ways of incorporating or leveraging self-transcendence into other existing strategies. So a couple of examples that are already out there include with reappraisal. As I mentioned, reappraisal is a very effective strategy, at least in the moment, to regulate emotions. But there are different ways of reappraising. So the example I gave, or I often give, is like reappraising a negative situation in a more positive light. Is that a question in the chat? Oh, nice. Is that last year though, the Resilience Symposium? Or is there a new one? I know he had last year, yeah. Keep an eye out though, if you're interested. He might put another one on. Anyway, so there are different ways to reappraise, and one way is to reinterpret a negative situation in a less negative light, so put a positive spin to it. So for instance, if you're stuck in traffic and you're really irked, well, think of it as an opportunity to listen to a podcast. It's like obligatory relaxation time. You have no choice, so you can make the best of it. But then there are other ways of reappraising. And one is social or psychological distancing, or also known as perspective taking, which is appraising the situation as if it had happened to someone else. Right. So if you have a client who is really upset about something they did that was really embarrassing and they're beating themselves up about it, I have read that one technique that can be useful is to have the person kind of reevaluate the situation from the perspective of it having happened, let's say, to their best friend. Like, imagine your best friend was in this situation. What would you tell them? How would you view them? Would you really think that they're the total idiot that you think you are right now? That kind of thing. So anyway, studies have shown that this kind of self-transcendent version of reappraisal, where you step out of yourself and you view the situation from a third person perspective, or even from a second person perspective too, can be more effective than just garden variety reappraisal. Another example of incorporating self-transcendence is in the context of self-affirmation. So you could self-affirm values that are self-enhancing, like, you know, I value appearing intelligent and competent, versus self-transcendent values, like I value contributing to something larger than the self. And as it happens, self-transcendent self-affirmation is more beneficial than self-enhancing self-affirmation. And so I guess we can extend this line of thinking into other types of interventions too. And maybe you guys can come up with more creative ways of doing these, but like some obvious ones that jumped out at me was, well, we know that reminiscence, like remembering the good old times, the positive memories, can be effective. Well, how would it be if we incorporated some self-transcendent experiences in there? Like people who've experienced childbirth and it was a positive experience for them, maybe recalling that would be a good thing. If you've been to the Grand Canyon and it wasn't, you know, Zen moment for you, recalling that might be a helpful thing. Same with the exercise, right? If a practitioner is going to recommend exercise, well, how would it be to recommend that the exercise be done outdoors? So you get your dose of nature as well. So it's that kind of thing, you know, get the bigger bang for your buck by piling on the different strategies, or, you know, combining them together. And so by the same token, it's kind of along those same lines, then you can have other combinations of strategies as well that could be powerful. And in fact, you know, so I mentioned earlier that having multiple pathways or combining strategies could be more powerful than just having a single strategy, because resilience factors can work in an additive way. Well, maybe that's part of the reason cognitive behavioral therapy is so effective. Right? Because you've got a lot going on in CBT. You've got cognitive restructuring, you've got stress inoculation, you got exposure. And from what I understand, having group CBT is even more effective for things like depression, because now you're adding the social connectedness component as well. And maybe that's why religion is so effective for people who are religiously engaged, right? Because there you get social support. If you gather, if the community gathers on a regular basis, you got compassion, you got gratitude with religion, you've got self-affirmation, so you're affirming important religious values on a regular basis. You got optimism there, right? You have faith in God's plan. And maybe in some religions, there's also some disclosure, where you can kind of get these negative feelings off your chest by confessing, or sometimes these mourning rituals for grieving can also add a component of social support and disclosure. Okay, so what are some creative ways that we can think of to combine strategies in a novel way? Well, how about, like, if we're going to recommend sports, well, how about team sports? Because now you're adding the social component to it, right? Because then with team sports, you're not only getting physical exercise and social connectedness, you're also getting self-efficacy. I guess self-efficacy would come with any kind of exercise, but you might also get the state of flow, so it's default mode pathway thing. I didn't talk about the state of flow, but we can, I'm happy to talk about it during discussion if people are interested. And then extreme sports kind of adds an added layer to that for people who are inclined, things like skydiving, because you add the benefit of that, like working with the distress pathway a little more too. There you're facing your fears and you're getting stress inoculation, and maybe you'll even get a little bit of awe, especially with that kind of view of the earth from top. I think that I've never skydived, but I imagine it would totally inspire awe. Anyway, so if you're not athletically inclined, but but you're musically inclined, being in a musical band could be an amazing thing. right? You're getting sensory pleasure there, so the reward network could get activated. Social connectedness, self-efficacy, flow, potentially awe. So all of these things can be lumped together in just one intervention. Anyway, so I mean, this is just sort of armchair hypothesizing at this point. But one thing that though I did do experimental work on, and this was for my dissertation, was I combined two strategies to see if you get a benefit to having compared to just one strategy. And that's the strategy of labeling and exposure. And I want to take a few minutes to talk about that. So what is affect labeling? Essentially affect labeling is the effect of mere words on emotional responding, right? It's the effect goes something like this, right? So passive observation of an emotionally evocative photo, and photos of people expressing emotions is very evocative as far as the brain is concerned. So it's a very reliable way to get the activity in the amygdala to go up. So passively viewing an emotional face increases amygdala activity. But viewing that emotional face along with affective labels. So in this particular example, the participant's task is to pick the label that goes with the face. So I guess here the answer is scared. But that kind of labeling, affective labeling, prevents the amygdala from showing an arousal, and instead it activates lateral prefrontal cortex. Emotional words do activate the lateral prefrontal cortex. However, you don't get this sort of emotional dampening if you use neutral words. So if they use gender labels instead, like choose the name that goes with the face, amygdala response happens. So it's not just a distraction effect, it's really specific to emotional words. And it's quite remarkable because participants are not instructed to regulate their emotions. In fact, in a follow-up study we showed that subjects' own expectations before the task is that labeling would increase their emotional response. And yet here you see with the amygdala and physiological arousal, the results are quite the contrary. So affective labeling is a case where emotional words, affective words, but not neutral words, activate lateral prefrontal cortex and reduce activity in the amygdala and physiological arousal. And in fact, the activity between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex is inversely correlated, right? So the more the prefrontal cortex comes on board, the less amygdala activity you see. And importantly, that relationship is mediated by activity in the medial prefrontal cortex. And the reason that's important is because the medial prefrontal cortex, we know from animal models, is super critical, is necessary for extinction, right? For overcoming fear, basically, for retention of extinction learning. So in other words, emotional words, but not neutral words, can activate a prefrontal network that we know is important for coping and extinction learning. And so the question I asked for my dissertation was whether labeling, this kind of affective labeling, can boost exposure outcomes, right? So if we combine labeling with exposure, do we get a bigger bang than just exposure alone? So we recruited undergraduate students who self-reported having, on a kind of a standardized scale, having phobia level fear of spiders. And we brought them into the lab. They were assigned to one of three groups. Either they were repeatedly exposed to photos of spiders over and over, just photos of spiders alone, that on day one, or a negative label group where they were repeatedly exposed to those same photos, but then each one was followed by a different negative word. And then a third group, a control group, where they were exposed with the photos and a neutral label. And so this is kind of an analog of exposure treatment. It's not an actual clinical study, it's a translational study. So then we brought everybody back a week later, and we showed them those photos from the prior week without any labels to see if there's decrease in their emotional arousal in terms of their sympathetic nervous system activity as measured by sweat gland activity in their hand. So the more you sweat, the more the sympathetic system is active. And we also showed them a set of novel photos they hadn't seen before to see if the extinction learning generalizes to novel photos. Okay, and maybe I want to kind of pick up speed here, but basically we found that all three groups showed improvement. So their skin conductance response, their sympathetic arousal went down from day 1 to day 8. So all three groups showed the benefit of being repeatedly exposed to photos. So that's good. But affective labels provided an added advantage where the negative label group showed even less arousal than the exposure only group. And this learning generalized to novel photos. So if you look at the negative label group, and this is only true of the negative label group, where arousal to novel photos on day 8 was lower than arousal to novel photos on day 1, right? So there is a benefit of being aroused, of being exposed to these photos over and over, along with labels, that helps you kind of generalize it to novel photos you haven't seen before. So anyway, the punchline here is that labeling can have long-lasting effects. It can help boost exposure outcome, and it can generalize to novel encounters. So just to kind of put a bow on this thing, so after I graduated, and right around the time that actually I was going on hiatus, a couple of graduate students came along and replicated these studies, working with the same graduate advisor that I worked with for my paper, and actually did clinical trials on this and showed that incorporating labeling into exposure therapy for spider phobia and for public speaking anxiety actually helped reduce fear compared to exposure alone. And so now labeling is being recommended by my faculty mentor, Dr. Michelle Krask, as a strategy to optimize exposure therapy. So this is an example of translational work where neuroscience, our knowledge of neuroscience, helped lead to practical insight into improving psychological therapy. And to piggyback on that, I'm wondering, so subsequent to this study, and then I got interested in addiction, and I wondered if we can translate this paradigm into the context of craving. So can we repurpose labeling for regulation of other undesirable psychological states like craving? And yes, there is some neuroscience justification for asking this question. Some of the work that I did a while back showed that the same lateral prefrontal regions that are active or activated in labeling, these same regions are part of a multi-purpose self-regulation network. So same prefrontal regions underlie different types of self-control, motor self-control, emotion self-control, craving self-control. So the motor self-control was like stop signal task. It's like a go, no go task. Emotion self-control is basically cognitive reappraisal. And the craving self-control in smokers was cognitive reappraisal as well, but in the context of cigarette cues. So we found in 2 separate studies that these 3 tasks activate the same part of the prefrontal cortex, but not other tasks. So it's really limited. It's very specific to inhibitory tasks, self-control tasks. And then in a methamphetamine study, we showed that performance on the motor task and the emotion regulation task, those 2 self-control tasks, performance on those tasks correlates with gray matter density in an overlapping region of the prefrontal cortex. So really suggesting that this prefrontal region is playing a kind of a wide role in self-regulation. So this prefrontal region is recruited by labels that are subjectively charged, and then maybe it would help with craving regulation the way it helps with emotion regulation. And so to answer this question, I designed a study where it's a lot like the affect labeling, but in the context of labeling cigarette cues in smokers. So you're like identifying or labeling your triggers. I think in the interest of time, I'll kind of breeze through this, but basically we have preliminary findings showing that, in fact, labeling smoking triggers activates this prefrontal region, and it's actually the only region it activates, but more importantly, it reduces self-reported craving and reduces activity in a craving-related region. And then there's another way to ask this repurposing question, and it's in the context of the resting state. So I guess I shouldn't have put the finding on the slide quite yet, but that's okay. So labeling is a good strategy for when we're faced with triggering cues, but what about when we're just sitting around, not engaged in any particular task? So this is called the resting state, where we're awake, we're alert, but we're not really engaged in a cognitively demanding task. And this is important to study because experience sampling studies suggest that we spend, can you guys take a guess, like how much of your day, or on average, how much of our day is spent just like mind wandering and engaging in like default mode thinking? Just to yourself, you can take a guess. I was floored when I saw this number. So it's 30 to 50% of the time of our waking hours are spent kind of engaging in mind wandering. So I think it's an important question to ask. So what are we thinking about when we're mind wandering? And the way we mind wander, does that influence the way we crave and the way we feel? So I did this study where I looked at resting state activity, particularly in the default mode network, and I wanted to see if it's related to negative affect, which we already kind of knew from the literature that it is, but I wanted to see whether it's also related to craving. That part was has been understudied. And so I was fortunate enough to be able to collaborate on this project where people who smoke on a regular basis, on a daily basis, were brought into the laboratory after overnight abstinence, and they were asked to fill out questionnaires about how much they're craving, how much state anxiety they're experiencing, and some other measures of negative affect. And we found that this similar part of the default mode network is related to these measures, these subjective measures. So so the greater the craving and negative affect, the greater the activity here. And so this study identifies the default mode, this particular region of the default mode, as a potential target for addiction in the same way that it has been used as a target in PTSD and depression. So you can just repurpose it for addiction. And I think it would be particularly potent for addiction because, or effective for addiction, because it could affect both craving and negative affect, which are reasons cited for relapse, especially in women. And in fact, women show greater activity, women in general, smoker or not, show greater activity in the default mode than men. And so I think this might help explain why women have a harder time than men quitting smoking. It's part of this negative affect and craving loop. So anyway, I'm very curious to see in subsequent studies whether targeting the DMN would be an effective tool here. Okay, so I know I'm kind of going over time here, so I'll breeze here a little bit. So in terms of tailoring intervention, one obvious implication of the model is that singular focus on down-regulating the negative is not enough, and because and in fact, many of the cognitive strategies that we use to downregulate the negative rely on the prefrontal cortex, but the prefrontal cortex shows deficits in some populations. So we know, for instance, in methamphetamine addiction, this exact prefrontal region is compromised. So maybe in these individuals, and this could include adolescents as well, who don't have fully developed prefrontal cortices, or people with very severe trauma, maybe these individuals may not benefit as much from cognitive coping strategies like reappraisal that really rely on this prefrontal region, but rather they might benefit more from more bottom-up strategies of, say, upregulating the positive or transcending the self. So just a couple of studies, I'll give quick examples. So mindfulness is an example. This is a study we conducted when I was faculty at CMU. We basically found that a simple mindfulness strategy compared to like a relax and look at the photo, just telling people when you see these photos of cigarette cues, these are abstinent smokers, just notice the cue and accept the cue. So just this very simple mindfulness instruction. There was a little bit more to it than that, but basically this mindfulness technique reduces craving in terms of self-report and neural measures, but also it does not activate the lateral prefrontal cortex. So this could be one of those bottom-up strategies that might be helpful to some people. Yeah, wait, am I going the wrong way? Oh yeah, wrong arrow, sorry. Oh, and I can skip this one. This is a study I proposed to look at the effect of physical exercise as another bottom-up strategy, but we can skip this. Okay, so just to summarize, I guess we already covered the lessons from the brain, and we covered the tripartite model. Just final portion of the presentation, applying the tripartite model. I talked about the different ways we can discover novel interventions. For instance, we talked about the example of awe, where there's evidence that it decreases activity in the default mode, but there's not a ton of evidence that it can have long-term psychological benefits. So that's a ripe area for research. We talked about leveraging self-transcendence by incorporating into existing strategies. We talked about leveraging additivity by combining different kinds of strategies. And I gave the example of affective labeling being combined with exposure. And we talked about repurposing, where you take one paradigm and in one context and use it for another context that might be similar. And then tailoring intervention, we talked about using bottom-up strategies like mindfulness and exercise to help populations who might struggle with strategies that rely heavily on the prefrontal cortex. In conclusion, I want to thank all of my collaborators and the funding sources throughout the years that have made all the work that I talked about possible. And importantly, I'd like to thank all of you for sticking through a whole hour and listening to me talk. Thank you, and I'm very excited to kind of hear what everybody thinks and how this all relates to the work that you do.
Wow, thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. Do you want to stop sharing your screen so we can all?
Good idea.
Really though, that was like food for the soul. My mind's going in a bunch of different directions and I have a lot of questions, but I want to open it up to the audience first to see what everyone else is thinking. But that was wonderful. I'm taking it all in.
I know I packed a lot.
No, it was amazing.
Yeah, absolutely loved what you shared in your presentation. Definitely the most comprehensive of like a model of everything that I've learned in bits and pieces and different books and different classes and different trainings. And it was so comprehensive. I feel like I took a screenshot of one of your your flowgrams because I love it. And it's very comprehensive. It would really help me with conceptualizing treatment plans for clients of like, oh, here's a buffet. Like, what do we do? We got a little buffet here. What is it that we want to start nibbling on and practicing? So I really appreciate the model.
I love that word buffet. I'm just going to write it down because I want to use it in future presentations. Thank you. Thank you so much for that feedback.
So I had a couple of thoughts as we went through it. And yes, I want to echo, thank you so much. Again, it gives me language to use with clients. But a couple of topics came up, like just the definition of coping, because I do counseling, but this idea of there's negative coping, right? People self-medicate, people avoid, and so it could be seen as reducing harm from stress, but maybe not. So the coping mechanisms or the coping that you're talking about probably needs a more narrow,
I should say adaptive coping.
Well, even people adapt by using the tools that they have, even if that means avoidance, right? So,
right, active. Well, adaptive as contrasted with maladaptive. But I see what you're saying.
Yeah, but another interesting thing that you said about addressing stress head on is, when you were saying that to reduce stress, and again, in my world, I kind of has to be careful with the coupling of trauma and the fact that the amygdala can experience memory in the same way of actual experience. right? And so if you don't have the coping mechanisms, you don't want to lead someone head on into addressing trauma. So we step back from that and talk about the tools first. But it's very interesting what you were talking about in terms of this idea of empty chair or third person, because you know, to one of the tools that it can be used in the same aspect of what you were talking about is the idea of audience and actor. So here's watching you as an actor, you're in the audience, you're perfectly safe, you're watching what's going on and evaluating with the prefrontal cortex, you know, and observing the feeling of what's going on, and can reframe how you want to see or experience what's going on the stage, which is the acting out of something in the past or the future. So I just wanted to add that piece, because I think it's very fascinating how the brain can give you the same experience from the memory piece as actually being in the experience.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, thank you for putting that on my radar too. I gotta fix up the language. I took some notes that when I talk about it. Yeah. Thanks so much.
We're always looking for the right language to use, right?
Dr. Tabibnia, I wonder if you could talk about flow. You mentioned it and said perhaps you could come to it. So I'd be very curious to hear you speak a little bit on that, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you.
Sure. So this is the work of, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on his name, but his last name is Csikszentmihalyi. It's got a very difficult spelling, but I talk about it in my paper, so you can look up his paper. He passed away a while back, I think, but amazing work where, so flow is defined as being in that state of mind where you're totally immersed in what you're doing and you lose track of time, you lose sense of yourself. And the way you get in that zone is by being engaged in a task where the difficulty matches your skill. So it's not so difficult that it's overwhelming, and it's not so easy that it's boring. So it's challenging you just the right amount. And so it sounds a lot like kind of this self-transcendent experience that we're talking about. And there are studies linking it to lower activity in the default mode network. So like mathematicians, for example, or chess players, when they're solving the problems that they like to solve, kind of get in that state. Or musicians, when they're playing a challenging piece, can get in that state. Athletes. Yeah, I'm sure we've all experienced it when we do something that is really engaging and challenging to the right degree.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Somebody else. That was amazing. My brain is like kind of pulsating right now. You get a lot of information and I can hardly even know where to start my notes. The default mode network that you talked about, and making the gender, that women spend more time in that, I think is what you said. Is that right? So I just wonder, it just occurs to me that anthropologically, you know, that women forever have been seen and not heard, you know, kind of seriously. And I do believe that there is a relationship between that and more of an internalizing, witnessing, observing, rather than just going out. Because in so, you know, for so long and in so many cultures, women didn't have the choice. They had to keep their mouth shut. So they had to do something with their brain, you know. Anyway.
So interesting. Another heard that before, but yeah.
Question, and you sort of answered it. My question in the beginning was, what about those for whom their prefrontal cortex is already compromised. Like if they have ADHD, or, you know, if their executive functioning is really low, you know. And you did, later on, you addressed that and suggested that there were ways around that. So I thought that was really helpful, although of course I don't remember exactly which ones. But the other, in my mind, I was thinking about, I work very much with people on the autism spectrum, okay? So I'm confronted with a lot of rigidity, and shall we call it confirmation bias, about, for some, the idea of doing something new to alleviate stress is more stressful, that they would rather stay with what's comfortable, which is crazy, you know? It's like, you know, like the Israelites wouldn't have left slavery if they felt like that, seriously. But it's a really, it's very—
Some didn't.
You know, yeah, I mean, they're resistant out of fear, but also out of black and white thinking. Emily, you know, I think about that a lot. And they also have their own expectation based on their experience, you know, kind of confirmation bias, if you will, that they reject the possibility of everything you say. So I'd be interested in it if anyone has any ideas about how to kind of go under their radar, which I do have some, I guess I'll call them tricks that work. But anyway, that's a lot of people, I think, not just on the autism spectrum, but for other reasons, would be very difficult to apply a lot of the things you've been suggesting.
Yeah. I mean, just off the top, and I'm curious to hear others' opinion as well, but just, so autism is a topic I know close to nothing about, except that one of my best friends did her master's thesis on the neural basis of autism. And I remember this was like a big paper that came out in one of the flagship journals, like Nature, Neuroscience, I think it was. But anyway, so she and others have linked autism to deficits in the default mode network as well, because it's also part of the social brain, the default mode network, some regions. So you're in a really difficult spot here, where you're saying like the kind of the middle pathway, the top-down regulation pathway, is going to be a tough one because it's effortful and they're going to be resistant because they've got their own rigid routines and everything. So maybe this is a situation where you got to use kind of these bottom-up strategies that bypass the prefrontal and maybe hopefully don't rely too much on the default stuff. And I don't exactly know what the deficiency is in the default mode, so maybe that makes a difference as well. But so and kind of an obvious example that comes to my mind is like breath work, right? So this very simple thing of making your exhalations longer than your inhalations, right? So this way you can kind of stimulate the parasympathetic system and kind of get some immediate calming effects. At least in the moment, that could be helpful.
Yeah, you're reminding me of a really cool thing that happened about 5 years ago with one of my clients, where it was the last session before they were going to college. So we did something special, and we did not have our session in my office. We went to the Botanic Gardens and we walked for an hour. And at the end, we sat down and I asked them if they noticed anything different. Because as you just pointed out, that self-awareness and being able to articulate the emotions and stuff, not so much. And this client did notice that they felt different and they felt more calm. So it was really cool because we did it. It was like, like tricking your kid into taking medicine by putting it in the hot chocolate or something. But it was really exciting. And it was exciting for them because we talked about how when they needed to get calm, they could go outside and walk around. And so it wasn't this big abstract thing, and it was really helpful. By the way, I use it all the time for myself too, and it really works. So, and
yeah, outdoor walks. Yeah, me too. They're awesome.
So this isn't much of a question, but it's kind of an observation. I just wanted to see if anyone had any thoughts during the presentation, but I was, thinking about like culturally, like just how our westernized culture after the Enlightenment, we've entered this age of reason and we've kind of become devoid of spirituality and religion and like hearing, finding purpose and meaning. And that's coming to front how important that is for our well-being and resilience. And I think it's so interesting because it's like the meeting of like non-Western cultures and things they've had, for time and time again. And we're just like discovering these things like, oh, it's brand new, or like, oh, it's new, like I was listening to something where they were talking about this traditional healer from a part of Russia where like they use tapping and healing, and like to us it's EMDR, but to them that's something else. And you think about like drumming in a circle, like for our westernized perspective, like, yeah, that's novel. Like you don't go to a treatment and like that's not what you're. So yeah, it's new for us, but it's not for others, and I think that's so fascinating. But,
wow. Yeah, we should bring these into the forefront of kind of Western research, like explore them. People tend to shy away from interventions that, aren't evidence-based, understandably, but if we could kind of bring them into the foreground. And I feel like the same thing happened kind of with meditation, like maybe 10, 20 years ago, mindfulness just wasn't a thing. And now like there's mainstream research done and everybody's kind of jumping on that bandwagon. Then same thing with acupuncture. I feel like it's becoming more and more acceptable that there's something there.
So it's interesting you say that, because when you were talking about mindfulness, when I talk to my clients about meditation, I talk to them in regards to telling them, well, mindfulness and meditation is not some weird thing. It really is just a brain exercise. It's, essentially it is like you mentioned in your talk about, ruminating about the future causes anxiety, ruminating about the past causes depression. But if you're in the present right now, you're safe. And that's what meditation is about, is bringing, doing an interrupt of your prefrontal cortex and coming back to your body, because where the body goes, the mind will follow, and where the mind goes, the body will follow. So if you come back to your, to the present moment, which is the mindfulness piece, then, and learn how to do that on a regular basis, you now have a tool to intervene on your behalf with your brain. And so it takes the mysticism of, ooh, that's some, weird philosophy, into, no, this is really science-based. If you don't like the philosophy, go to the science kind of thing. I think that's where neuroscience has been so amazing, and the work that you're doing is it's bringing credibility to all these things. I think intuitively have been used in other parts of the world that work, but bringing it into a perspective for Western world that they can really buy into, because the science is there that says this is why, and this, and this is what needs to happen. And the fact that you also are showing with what you presented, that we don't have to always turn to medications and prescriptions, that there are things that work holistically, that can be just as powerful. And how amazing is that?
Nice.
Reminds me, I was wondering what type of or class of psychiatric medications had that regulating effect. Was it like antidepressants or stimulants or antipsychotics, or was it just general?
Which system? I
Um,
mean, the antidepressants came up a lot. Here, I'm going to go to that slide, and you know what I should do is just go straight there instead of click my way and annoy everybody. Okay.
I just says it like in a general sense of like when you were mentioning medication, like was it referring to just antidepressants or like, oh.
Yeah, so I mean, when I was talking about the evidence for each of the 3 different pathways and how, for instance, so like antidepressants, like SSRIs, do normalize default mode function, for instance, so that they reduce activity there. But there are other interventions as well, like transcranial stimulation, so like using these strong magnets that can get you the same effect. Yeah, so it's mostly antidepressants in terms of the medications that show these effects in the default mode and also the amygdala pathway, the HPA.
Oh, yeah, I was just curious, like after you were talking about the dopamine, which that was in itself was so fascinating. Like I remember in the slide, now I'm like blanking, but you were like, oh, this is so interesting, I could go on. And I was like, yes, but I was wondering about like stimulant medications because those also have that dopamine interaction, right? Yeah.
But you were wondering what medications stimulate the dopamine pathway? Is that what you just said?
No. I was just like wondering if like stimulants were included in like what you were talking about but no, yeah.
Oh yes, no, oh yeah, totally. Yeah, so stimulants and really all addictive drugs, people talk about it, how it hijacks the reward pathway. So you brought me to where I said I want to talk some more about dopamine. I'll go there. So the dopamine system is really interesting. It's not just part of what people think of as the reward pathway, but it's also an important part of a learning pathway. So the reason something is rewarding and it feels so good is basically evolutionarily there to get you to do the thing again. Because if things that feel good tend to be good for you, like food, sex, they kind of help you to reproduce and, you know, pass your genes along, which is your ultimate goal. And so they feel that good. And when they're so surprisingly good, your brain takes note of it and goes, oh, this is important, I'm going to do this again. So dopamine is important for that kind of learning, reward-based learning, but it's also important, as you can see why, for motor systems, for action. So dopamine is part of our motivational system. It's the fire that is lit under us to get us to do things. So things that are motivating, that get you to want to get up and do things are things that also kind of are rewarding. Yeah, I think that's what I was referring to earlier, but there was something else you said that reminded me I should cover this. Now I can't remember. Maybe it was addictive drugs. Yeah, so addictive drugs, what's going on with them is that, so like if food gets you, I don't know, this much dopamine, like addictive drugs give you that much dopamine. And so it's so powerful that it becomes super compelling. So you really want to go do it again. But of course, you know, there's habituation, there's tolerance. And so you need more and more of the drug to get the same peak. And it's a whole big problem.
Laura, were you going to say?
I just have I can't think of it right now, of course. But in addition to dopamine, aren't there some other rewarding sort of chemicals, like the relationship one, like the
oxytocin, the attachment?
Yeah. Does that factor into?
Yes. Yes, so oxytocin also interacts with the dopamine system. It's important in mother-child attachment, in romantic attachment. And it too can have antidepressant effects and have an impact on the amygdala fear pathway. So yes, there's definitely some parallels there. Serotonin is another, as you all know, related to mood. So serotonin is thought of more of like the neurotransmitter that brings contentment. So you're, being content. So it's not so much action oriented. In fact, maybe it's the opposite. You're like become content and like you're a little less motivated. Maybe that's part of the reason antidepressants have the side effect of lowering libido, because now you're content. It's like, well, I got everything I need.
Emily brought something up that I thought was pretty interesting in the chat. Right before you said coping and resilience are not personality traits, I had just written down not personality traits, because I think that there is a perception by just about everybody that they are personality traits, and a failure is a deficit of personality, you know, just as, well, I mean, I guess it's obvious where I'm going here. So again, that is, it's almost like people who resist therapy because they think it's a weakness. They should be able to, you know, take care of it themselves. But I think that is really one of the most foundational, important parts of everything you said, because I do believe that there is a presumption that the things that we're talking about that are, thank goodness, because of the flexibility of the brain and what's possible to learn, that's a whole new idea, you know, and so I really appreciate your having said that.
Nice. Yeah, I think so too. I mean, there are some people, I was approached by a journalist who kind of took a different view, who thought, well, you know, what about this argument? And I guess he was quoting other faculty. He's like, what about this argument that when you tell people that they can become more resilient, doesn't it put pressure on them? And then so if you fail to then become resilient, then it becomes like a whole other thing that adds to your despair. And it could lead to a culture of like victim blaming, basically. It's like, well, you could be more resilient, but you're not doing it. So now, you know, it's on you. So I guess I can see how you would have that perspective, but my counter argument to that is that, no, it's empowering to know that the option is there. It's challenging. No one said it's easy, and it's different. People are different. Different people are faced with different challenges, and they have a different starting point in terms of their neural makeup. So it's not a comparison thing. The idea is that within your own individual context, there's wiggle room. You can't compare yourself to someone else and say, well, you know, I'm not as resilient. Then it's just circumstances are different.
It's been a real challenge for me to hold both, and that, like, yes, the individual is so capable of learning new skills and of feeling better. And I see these companies being like, oh no, you don't need any more time at home. You need to learn to meditate. Well, it is like, it becomes an excuse to keep bombarding people with stressors. Like, you can take it, you can take it, you can take it. Just learn to take it. And like being able to hold both of those things, like, yes, people are so capable of becoming more resilient. And like, can we also do the systemic things to make them have to be? Can we decrease racism and decrease oppression and decrease the things that make them miserable? So like holding both has been tough for me.
You know, so I'm glad you bring that up, because what I'm hoping is that eventually at some point, like, this framework could be used to make that argument. It's the whole reward pathway thing. You know, vacation is important. Yeah, right. Yeah, one of my colleagues.
Salary.
One of my colleagues here in the psychology department at UC Irvine, Sarah Pressman, is doing work on the importance of these positive experiences on well-being, taking time off, taking breaks. Like, cognitive psychologists have known this for a long time. Your prefrontal cortex can't just keep going and going. Like, it needs to take a break and refresh. Otherwise, creativity suffers. And what boss wants that in their employees?
Yeah, I work primarily with college students, and we're seeing such a motivation challenge because it's hard to get the outcomes you used to get. Like, you have to work harder, you have to be more competitive, you have to be better, you have to be able to work in primarily white institutions, and it's even more work harder with less outcomes. You don't get pensions anymore, you don't get salary raises, you don't get nearly the benefits and the outcomes that you used to even 20-30 years ago. So college students are like, why am I doing any of this and paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for it? So that, like, reward, like, we actually need to pay people and give them benefits and give them something to work for, it, like, really resonates with me. And I think that's awesome.
Nice. I agree.
I was wondering if you'd done any kind of, when you were talking about the dopamine and the serotonin, and, we know that, like, I don't know, 50% or something dopamine is made in the gut, and, upwards of 80 or 90% of serotonin. When you were doing these studies of trying to do the reframing as positive and those kinds of things, because there is such a connection between the nutrients and what we're introducing into our diet, and the ability to create those feel-good chemicals that then affect our brain and our ability to learn or flex or change, in terms of those kinds of things. If introducing at the time you're trying to shift that focus from negative to positive, if in addition to that you're kind of controlling the intake of diet along with that, if that makes a significant, is also another significant factor in the ability for these other avenues and approaches that you're introducing to be effective or even more effective.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think, like, nutrition neuroscience is so fascinating, and I know so little about it. It is definitely outside my area. But I will say this about serotonin and dopamine. I'm not sure that those cross the blood-brain barrier. I mean, I know dopamine doesn't. So you could have these in your gut, but I don't know that it's going to affect your brain.
Yeah,
but
that's what I've heard as well.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think that, it may not cross the blood-brain barrier, but the fact of the matter is, if you're not able to produce those chemicals in your gut because of your inability to get the nutrients, and I mean, even what you produce in your brain has to come from amino acid building blocks in your gut, and and that comes from what you're eating, right? So if you don't have the ability to create those initial building blocks for those chemicals, then your ability to create those chemicals is going to impact your ability to have those chemicals available in a positive manner that then affects mental health as well, right?
Right. Yeah, no, that's an important question.
Yeah. And if your body, even with that, if your mind is busy ruminating on the inflammation that your body is creating by not having, by not feeling good because you don't have the right things in your gut, then you're going to be in a more consistent stress factor, just as a regular your tipping point of stress, ability to deal with stress is always going to be at a higher set point already as a norm. And, again, all those facts, it gets really complicated and complex really quickly because there can be so many added factors. But yeah, sorry.
It's a good idea for a future speaker, maybe.
Sorry, I introduced that because if nothing else, the simplicity of the things that you do mention that are direct factors that we can control and utilize is probably the glass is half full.
Yeah, good. I like that take. I see so many comments in the chat and I didn't have a chance to read any of them. Is there any chance you could send those to me?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, of course, I can email those. Actually, yes, that's a great idea. Yes, send those over to me.
Name it to tame it. Oh my gosh, I love it.
Yes.
That's a Daniel Siegalism.
Oh, cool. Good. Thank you for teaching me that.
Well, I feel like I could stay on and talk to you forever. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really wonderful to hear.
Thank you.
Yeah, I know. I can't believe we're already past the time, but thank you so much. It's really been an honor. So I'll be in touch to get the questions and I'll send them out to Daniel. Actually, Daniel, may you just send me your email in the chat so I have it, just to make sure. Thank you again. That was really, really wonderful.
Cool. Thank you so much. Yeah, I really enjoyed this and got some good food for thought. It's great to get the kind of clinical perspective on it. And I look forward to kind of reviewing the discussion and the notes here in the chat box as well.
Right. Yeah. Well, let me know if you have any questions. I'm going to send you the recording probably on Monday. I know it has to get processed through, but again, thank you so much. It's food for the soul. And
I'm so glad to hear. One thing I realized I didn't get to hear from everyone is the work that you're all doing that's related to neuroscience. Shoot, I completely forgot to ask.
Oh yeah, yeah, I know. Well, Dr. Beeson I'm sure would love to, if you're interested, because he is running the Neuroscience Integration Lab. I know we have 4 different projects going on, but in if you saw his email with his app, the resiliency, yeah, I'm sure we can definitely arrange a time to connect again. But
cool. Yeah. Okay, yeah, I'll look through that. That's a great suggestion to see what how you guys are applying neuroscience in the context of. Yeah,
I mean, it's a lot. It's well, what do we mean by neuroscience? Are we talking about the explicit science, or is it anything that talks about the brain? It's kind of leading to all of that, and it's very creative. But yeah, thank you again. I want to respect your time, but I'll be in touch with everything else.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks so much. Nice to meet you. You too. Bye.